The Draconis soldiers chuckled, their scaled faces crinkling with amusement. Farmer Gary Lewis, this overgrown mudball's designated protector. Sergeant Vorlag, his reptilian eyes glinting beneath the harsh crassier sun, spat a wad of something viscous and green onto the parched earth. This weakling, he is supposed to defend these humans. Corporal Zorgeth, hefting his plasma rifle, snorted, a puff of hot, sulphurous air escaping his nostrils. Perhaps he will offer them a strongly worded letter of complaint. They watched Gary Lewis, a man built like an oak but weathered like driftwood, as he tended his meager crop of synth corn. His movements were slow, deliberate, each action betraying a quiet strength, but nothing that screamed protector. He wore simple, patched overalls, his hands calloused and stained with soil. The air hung thick with the smell of turned earth, diesel fumes from the Draconis vehicles, and the faint, metallic tang that always clung to the occupiers. Suddenly, a screech of metal tore through the relative quiet. A Draconis battle tank, its massive treads churning the soil, lurched violently, its driver's attention clearly elsewhere. The tank careened off the dirt road and smashed directly into a small wooden shed, the structure collapsing under the immense weight. A child's scream pierced the air, high-pitched and filled with terror. The sound cut through the Draconis soldiers' amusement like a shard of ice. The child, a girl no older than 6, was trapped beneath the heavy wreckage. Vorlag and Zorgeth exchanged a glance, a flicker of indifference in their reptilian eyes. Casualties were a part of war, and these humans were little more than livestock. Zorgeth began to adjust his rifle, preparing to clear the area. Gary, however, reacted instantly. He dropped his hoe, the tool clattering uselessly to the ground. Ignoring the Draconis soldiers' jeers and taunts, he sprinted towards the tank, his face a mask of iron will. "Look at the mud pig run," Vorlag barked, his voice infused with scorn. Gary reached the tank, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He planted his hands against the cold, unyielding metal of the tank's chassis. His knuckles turned white as he gripped, his muscles bunching and straining beneath his worn clothes. He gritted his teeth, his face contorted with effort. A low, guttural growl escaped his lips. Then, impossibly, the tank began to rise. Inch by agonizing inch, Gary lifted the battle tank, just enough for another farmer, a woman with dirt-streaked cheeks and desperate eyes, to crawl beneath the wreckage and pull the screaming child free. Draconis soldier Aurora, standing slightly apart from Vorlag and Zorgeth, stared in disbelief. Her usually impassive features betrayed a flicker of something akin to shock. She had never seen such raw, untamed strength. A quick flash of memory assaulted Gary's mind. A younger man, face covered in grime, screaming orders amidst explosions, the acrid smell of burning flesh filling his nostrils. The memory vanished as quickly as it came, leaving him shaken but focused. The Draconis soldiers, recovering from their initial surprise, regained their composure. Vorlag strode towards Gary, his scaled face hardening. "Human, explain this display of strength." Gary remained silent, his eyes fixed on the woman as she cradled the sobbing child. He wouldn't give them anything. He wouldn't expose his community or himself to further scrutiny. Aurora stepped forward, her voice surprisingly soft. "Why human? Why risk yourself for them?" A spark of something that might have been empathy flickered in her eyes, warring with the ingrained prejudice of her upbringing. Gary's eyes didn't leave the child for a moment. He never looked at Aurora. The Draconis captain, his scaled throat pulsing, pointed a clawed finger at Gary. "You will submit to testing, human. Such strength cannot be natural. We must understand its source." Gary met the captain's gaze, his face impassive. It was adrenaline, Captain. A man does what he has to in an emergency. Before the captain could respond, a small figure darted forward. Lily, the rescued child, threw her arms around Gary's legs, her voice muffled against his worn trousers. "You saved me, Mr. Lewis. You're a hero." Aurora watched, the child's innocent adoration a sharp contrast to the raw power she had just witnessed. How could such gentleness and such strength reside in the same being? The captain, clearly frustrated, snapped his mandibles. If the human refuses to cooperate, we will take what is owed by other means. Confiscate their crops. Compensation for the disruption of military operations. A wave of murmurs rippled through the gathered farmers. The Draconis soldiers, their plasma rifles glinting in the afternoon sun, moved towards the fields. Gary remained still, his fists clenched at his sides. "This is an outrage," Old Man Hemlock shouted, stepping forward. "Those crops are all we have to survive the winter." The soldiers advanced, their reptilian eyes cold. Aurora stepped between them and Hemlock, her voice sharp. "Captain, with respect, excessive force against civilians violates Standing Regulation 34B, subsection 7. The captain's head swiveled towards her, his gaze venomous. "Lieutenant, are you questioning my orders?" "I am upholding regulations, sir," Aurora replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. The captain hesitated, then spat on the ground. "Fine, but Lewis, you are being watched. Any further displays, and the consequences will be severe." He gestured to his soldiers, and they turned and marched back to their transport, leaving a palpable sense of dread in their wake. As the Draconis soldiers departed, Aurora lingered, her gaze fixed on Gary. Gary felt her eyes on him. A sudden jarring image flashed through his mind. The acrid smell of burning metal, the screams of the dying, a faceless enemy charging through a smoke-filled battlefield. He blinked, the vision receding, leaving him breathless and disoriented. "Why didn't you fight back, Gary?" Hemlock demanded, his voice infused with bitterness. "You could have stopped them. Now we'll all starve." Gary turned away, unable to meet the old man's accusing gaze. "It's not worth it, Hemlock. Fighting only makes things worse." That night, under the pale glow of the twin moons, Gary knelt beside a small, injured creature, a six-legged, feathered xeno-cat, its wing twisted at an unnatural angle. He gently splinted the wing with scraps of wood and cloth, his touch surprisingly delicate for a man of his size. Unseen, Aurora watched from the shadows, her confusion deepening. Back at the Draconis outpost, Aurora stood before her superior officer, Commander Vrook. "The human settlement is struggling, Commander. Their resources are stretched thin." She omitted any mention of Gary's strength. Vrook waved a dismissive claw. "Their suffering is irrelevant. Increase patrols in that sector. Ensure compliance with Empire regulations." The next morning, as Gary drove his battered hover truck towards the market, laden with what little produce he had managed to salvage, a Draconis patrol flagged him down. "Halt, human!" The lead soldier barked, his voice amplified by a vocoder. "We require a toll for passage." Gary stopped the truck, his lips pursed. "I have little to spare, soldiers, but I can offer you a trade, fresh vegetables for fuel rations." The soldiers exchanged glances, then laughed. "Trade? You think we need your dirt-scratched greens? Hand over your goods, human, or face the consequences." Gary refused, his voice low but firm. "I worked hard for this, I won't give it away." One of the soldiers, growing impatient, shoved Gary roughly. He stumbled, his sleeve riding up his arm, revealing a glimpse of gleaming metallic implants beneath his skin. Aurora, observing the scene from the crest of a nearby hill, felt a jolt of shock. Implants. What kind of human had implants like that? Her orders were clear: maintain order, suppress dissent. But something about this situation felt wrong. The flashbacks worsened. This time a voice, his own, screaming in the dark, a medic telling him he was lucky to be alive. He was a weapon. Later that day, Aurora found Gary alone, mending a fence on the edge of his property. She approached him cautiously, her hand resting on the hilt of her plasma pistol. "Lewis," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "What are those implants, and what are you really?" Gary's teeth clenched. He looked away towards the endless rows of soy crops. "Farming accident, plain and simple. Augurs are hungry things." Aurora's reptilian eyes narrowed, studying him. The afternoon sun glinted off the metallic band circling his left wrist, disappearing under the worn fabric of his shirt. It was too precise, too seamless to be the result of any accident she had ever witnessed. And there was something in his reaction, a flicker of pain, quickly masked, that told her he was hiding something far more significant. An unfortunate incident, she said, her voice carefully neutral. My apologies for prying. A guttural roar echoed across the fields. A squad of Draconis soldiers, clad in their crimson armor, were systematically tearing through Farmer McGregor's soybean crop. The air filled with the sickening crunch of stalks and the metallic shriek of heavy treads. Gary swore under his breath, a low rumble of frustration. He started towards the soldiers, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Hold on, what are you doing? Those are his livelihood. The lead Draconis, a hulking brute with jagged horns, sneered at Gary. Compliance is mandatory, Terran. These fields are now property of the Empire. Resistance is futile. He gestured with his weapon, and another soldier unleashed a blast that vaporized a swath of crops. Aurora watched, her scales prickling with a growing unease. She approached the captain, her voice tight. Captain Vorlag, with respect, these actions seem excessive. The requisition orders only specified a percentage. Vorlag, a veteran with scarred scales and cold, reptilian eyes, turned to her, his gaze dismissive. You question my orders, Lieutenant. I merely seek clarification, sir, Aurora replied, carefully maintaining her composure. Vorlag chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Clarification. Very well, the Empire requires resources, these humans. They are slow to yield. We accelerate the process. A hungry population is a compliant population. Is that clear enough for you, Lieutenant? Leaving Aurora speechless, Vorlag turned back to the destruction, his laughter echoing across the ravaged fields. As the Draconis soldiers moved on to the next farm, leaving behind a trail of devastation, Gary was already helping McGregor salvage what he could. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his large hands deftly repairing damaged irrigation lines and resetting fallen support beams. His knowledge of machinery was surprisingly comprehensive, a stark contrast to his simple farmer persona. Later that evening, as Gary was securing his tools, Aurora approached him, her expression unreadable in the fading light. She held out a small, palm-sized device. It was a Draconis multi-tool used for field repairs and diagnostics. This fell off one of the transports, she said, her voice low. It might be useful. Gary eyed the tool with suspicion. What's the catch? No catch, Aurora said, her gaze direct. The tool is modified. Certain limitations have been bypassed. It will allow you to repair things that are normally beyond your capabilities. Gary hesitated, his hand hovering over the tool. I don't need your charity. Just then, Old Man Hemlock, Gary's neighbor, hobbled over, his face etched with worry. Gary, I heard what happened to McGregor. My harvester's gone kaput, and I need to get the rest of my yield in before the Draconis come for it all. Can you take a look? Gary sighed, his shoulders slumping. He looked from Hemlock's pleading face to the Draconis tool in Aurora's hand. Finally, he took it. All right, he said, his voice grudging, but don't expect any thanks. That night, under the flickering light of his workshop, Gary examined the Draconis tool. He recognized the advanced technology, the intricate circuitry, and the subtle energy signatures. He also saw the modifications Aurora had mentioned. With a few adjustments, he could amplify the tool's capabilities, turning it into something far more powerful. He could use it to repair the farmers' equipment, to restore their livelihoods. He could also use it to something else. As he worked, a sudden image flashed through his mind. A burning village, the screams of the dying, the metallic tang of blood in the air. He stumbled back, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He was back in the Krellian War, pinned down behind a crumbling wall as alien plasma fire ripped through his squad. He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting the rising tide of panic. Across the valley, Aurora stood before a hidden Draconis communication relay. a camouflaged structure nestled deep within a grove of trees. She tapped into the encrypted network, her fingers flying across the console. A stream of data scrolled across the screen, revealing the true purpose of the Draconis occupation. It wasn't just about resources. It was about control. And something far more sinister. She discovered detailed geological surveys, pinpointing a massive deposit of a rare mineral beneath Gary's farm, a mineral essential for the Draconis Empire's advanced weaponry. The Draconis were not just occupying the planet. They were strip mining it, draining its lifeblood, and condemning its inhabitants to a slow, agonizing death. Later that night, under the cloak of darkness, Gary and Aurora met near the edge of his soy field. "They're not just here for the crops," Aurora said, her voice urgent. "They're after something else, something under your land." Gary listened, his expression grim. "I had a feeling. What is it?" "A mineral," Aurora said, "critical to their war effort. They'll strip this planet bare to get it." Gary stared out at his farm, at the fields he had cultivated for years, at the home he had built with his own 2 hands. He thought of his wife, buried beneath the ancient oak tree. He thought of the children in the village, their futures hanging in the balance. "Then we stop them," he said, his voice low and resolute. "But I can't do it alone. I need your help." Aurora nodded, her reptilian eyes gleaming in the darkness. "I will help you. I know their tactics, their weaknesses, and I know something about those implants of yours." Gary stiffened. "They're similar to what we use in our youth to make them stronger." Gary's breath hitched. The world swam, the burning village, the screams. He doubled over, clutching his head, a strangled cry escaping his lips. The soy field dissolved into a chaotic blur of light and shadow. Aurora stepped forward, her voice calm and steady. "Breathe, Gary, breathe. There is a meditation technique, a way to control the echoes. Let me help you." She reached out, her hand hovering over his arm. "Focus on my voice. Focus on your breath. You are safe now. You are here with me." The calm crackled to life. "Harvest report complete. Sector 4, green across the board, expecting a bumper crop of." Gary adjusted the frequency, tuning out the mundane details and focusing on the encrypted channels he'd established. Draconis patrol just passed through Sector 7, heavy armor heading west. He killed the transmission, a knot tightening in his stomach. The network was working, information flowing freely between the farms, but it was also a beacon. Across the fields, Sergeant Vorlag snarled, his reptilian eyes scanning the horizon. "Comm chatter is off the charts. These mud farmers are up to something." He tapped his wrist-mounted device. "Increase patrol density. I want random searches, every farm, starting now." The Draconis patrol slammed into the Lewis farm an hour later. 4 heavily armored soldiers, weapons raised, stormed through the fields, trampling crops underfoot. They kicked open the door to the farmhouse, scattering tools and supplies. "Where is it?" One of the soldiers barked, his voice distorted by his helmet. "Where are you hiding the weapons?" Gary stood his ground, his hands clenched at his sides. "We're farmers. We don't have weapons." The soldier shoved him against the wall. A small child, hiding behind his mother, cried out as a piece of farming equipment toppled, a sharp edge slicing across his arm. A thin line of blood welled up. A jolt of pure, white-hot terror ripped through Gary. He was back there in the Humvee, the explosion. The screams, Sarah, quick cuts, a mangled vehicle, flames licking the sky. His wife's lifeless eyes staring up at him, screaming. He blinked, gasping for air, the farmhouse swimming back into focus. The Draconis soldier was sneering at the crying child. Aurora stepped forward, her voice tight. "That's enough. He's just a child." The soldier ignored her, searched the barn. Later, as Gary tended to the boy's wound, Aurora watched him, her brow furrowed. I didn't realize." "Realize what?" Gary asked, his voice flat. The cost of our presence here. I joined the Draconis Empire to serve, to protect, but..." She trailed off, unable to meet his gaze. "This isn't protection, it's occupation," Gary finished for her. That night, under the cloak of the star-dusted sky, they spread a holographic map of the Draconis mining operation across the kitchen table. "The main power generator is here," Aurora said, pointing to a pulsating node on the map. "If we can disable it, it'll cripple their entire operation." "And buy us some time," Gary added, tracing the network of underground tunnels that snaked beneath his farm. "They don't know these tunnels exist. I used them to irrigate hard-to-reach places." Aurora nodded. "These tunnels, they could be our advantage, but the generator is heavily guarded. We need a way to get past the security." "What about their enhancements?" Gary asked, remembering what Aurora had told him. "You said they rely on them." "They do," Aurora confirmed. "Neural implants, strength augmenters. They're all linked to a central network. Disrupt the network and you disrupt the soldier." A grim smile touched her lips. "They become vulnerable." Days blurred into a cycle of planning and preparation. Aurora taught Gary meditation techniques, trying to help him control the flashbacks, the rage that simmered beneath his calm exterior. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah. "Focus on your breath," Aurora instructed, her voice soft. "Let the images pass through you without clinging to them." He tried, but the images were relentless, the sounds deafening. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His hands trembled. "It's no use," he said, his voice strained. "I can't." "You can," Aurora insisted. "You have to for them." She gestured towards the farmhouse where the children played in the yard. During a supply run to a nearby town, Gary and Aurora found more than they bargained for. Huddled in the shadows of a ruined building, a group of human refugees, their faces gaunt with hunger and fear. "The Draconis," a woman whispered, her voice hoarse. "They burned our village, took everything." Gary's eyes sharp. He couldn't leave them to die. "Get in the truck," he said, his voice low. "I'll take you back to the farm." Aurora looked at him, a flicker of concern in her eyes. "Gary, we barely have enough supplies for ourselves." "We'll make it work," he said, his gaze unwavering. Back at the farm, Gary ushered the refugees into the barn, offering them what little food and blankets he had. Aurora watched him, her conscience warring with her duty. That night, under the cover of darkness, Aurora slipped away from the farm. She made her way to the Draconis supply depot, her movements fluid and silent. Using her access codes, she rerouted a convoy of food and medical supplies, diverting it to a hidden location near the refugee camp. The next morning, Captain Valerius, his scaled face etched with suspicion, summoned Aurora to his office. The supply convoy, it never reached its destination. "A malfunction, Captain," Aurora said, her voice steady. "A faulty navigation system. I've already filed a report." Valerius narrowed his eyes, his gaze piercing. "A malfunction or something more? Deliberate?" "I am a loyal soldier of the Draconis Empire," Aurora said, her voice unwavering. Valerius leaned forward, his voice a low growl. "Loyalty is a precious commodity, Lieutenant, and easily broken." Under the cover of the next moonless night, Gary and Aurora put their plan into action. Gary, guided by his intimate knowledge of the farm, led Aurora through the hidden tunnels, bypassing the Draconis security perimeter. They reached the main power generator, a massive humming machine that throbbed with energy. Aurora worked quickly, her fingers dancing across the control panel. She bypassed the security protocols, accessing the generator's core systems. Almost there. She murmured, sweat beading on her brow. Suddenly, a klaxon blared, shattering the silence. Red lights flashed, illuminating the tunnel. "We've been detected," Gary shouted. Draconis soldiers poured into the tunnel, weapons raised. Aurora whirled around, drawing her plasma pistol. "Go," she yelled at Gary, firing a burst of energy at the approaching soldiers. "Get out of here. I'll cover you." Gary hesitated, his hand hovering over his own weapon, but he knew what he had to do. He turned and fled into the darkness, the sounds of plasma fire echoing behind him. Aurora had made her choice. She had defected. The Draconis soldiers were in pursuit. The chase was on. The tunnel behind them groaned, a slow, agonizing shriek of collapsing earth. Gary didn't wait, didn't dare. He slammed his shoulder against the next support beam, the rotting wood splintering under the force. Dust billowed, choking the air, the already dim light from Aurora's rifle flickering erratically. "That'll slow them," he rasped, his lungs burning. "But not for long, this way." They scrambled forward, deeper into the earth. The tunnel narrowed, forcing them to hunch, the rough-hewn walls scraping against their shoulders. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp soil and decaying root vegetables, a low, earthy smell that clung to the back of the throat. Finally, the tunnel opened into a larger space, a root cellar, packed with crates and shadowed recesses. Another tunnel branched off, and another, a warren of interconnected chambers beneath the farm. "Where are we?" Aurora asked, her voice tight. "Part of the original farm," Gary said, his gaze sweeping the space. "Root cellars, my grandpappy built them. Good for storing crops, good for hiding." Aurora activated her comms, her fingers dancing over the Draconis interface. Static crackled, then a voice, harsh and guttural. She listened intently, her scaled brow furrowing. "They believe I was coerced," she said, switching off the device. "They are broadcasting orders to search for me, alive if possible, my unit. They still hope for my return." A flicker of something unreadable crossed her face. Regret, shame. A whimper echoed from the far corner of the cellar. Gary moved towards the sound, Aurora close behind. Huddled in the shadows were the refugees from the farmhouse, their faces gaunt, their eyes wide with fear. A child coughed, a dry, rattling sound. "We're running out of food," a woman whispered, her voice hoarse. "The little ones. They need something to eat." Gary knelt, his hand resting on the shoulder of the nearest child, his fists tight. "We'll figure something out," he said, the words sounding hollow even to himself. He stood, turning to face the adults. "We can't just hide here. They'll find us eventually. We need to fight back." A murmur of fear rippled through the group. "Fight against the Draconis. We're farmers, not soldiers." "I know," Gary said, his voice low, "but we have no choice. I can teach you some things, enough to defend yourselves." Aurora stepped forward. "I can help. I know their tactics, their weaknesses. We can use this farm to our advantage." She gestured to the network of tunnels and cellars. "This is a defensible position. We can prepare traps, ambushes. Turn our homes into a battlefield." A man protested, his face etched with despair. Gary's face tightened. "I know it's not ideal, but what other choice do we have?" The following days were a blur of frantic activity. Gary, despite his reservations, began training the farmers. He showed them how to use their tools as weapons, how to move silently through the fields, how to use the terrain to their advantage. Aurora, leveraging her Draconis training, devised a guerrilla warfare strategy, turning the farm into a deadly maze. During one training session, Gary was demonstrating a disarming technique when a farmer lunged at him with a pitchfork. The movement, the angle of the weapon, triggered something in Gary's mind. He saw not a pitchfork but a bayonet, smelled not the sweet scent of hay but the acrid stench of burning flesh. He froze, his hands trembling, his eyes wide with terror. "Gary." Aurora's voice cut through the fog of his memory. "Gary, what's wrong?" He blinked, the image fading, leaving him shaken and disoriented. The farmers stared at him, their faces a mixture of concern and frustration. Later, Aurora found him sitting alone in the root cellar, his head in his hands. "What was that?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Flashbacks," he said, his voice muffled. "From the war. I can't lead them like this." Aurora sat beside him, her scaled hand resting lightly on his arm. "Draconis soldiers. We are taught meditation techniques to control our emotions, to focus our minds. Perhaps it could help you." He looked at her, skepticism warring with desperation in his eyes. The meditation was unlike anything Gary had ever experienced. Aurora guided him through a series of breathing exercises, focusing on his senses, on the feel of the earth beneath him, the sound of the wind in the trees, the scent of the soil. Slowly, gradually, the images from the past began to recede, replaced by a sense of calm, of control. A week later, a small group of Draconis soldiers breached the outer defenses of the farm. Alarms blared and the farmers scrambled to their positions. Gary, his heart pounding, grabbed his rifle and raced towards the sound of the fighting. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and the sound of gunfire. A young farmer lay on the ground, bleeding from a laser wound. The sight, the smell of burning flesh, triggered the PTSD. Gary's vision blurred, his hands began to shake, and the world seemed to tilt around him. "Gary," Aurora's voice, sharp and urgent, cut through the chaos. She grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her. "Focus. Breathe. Remember what I taught you." He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and focused on the feel of her hand on his face, on the sound of her voice. The images from the past receded, replaced by a cold, burning rage. He opened his eyes, his gaze hardening. He saw the Draconis soldiers, their faces contorted in cruel satisfaction. He saw the wounded farmer lying helpless on the ground, and he knew what he had to do. He moved with a speed and ferocity that surprised even himself. He charged towards the Draconis soldiers, his rifle blazing. He used his strength, his rage, to overwhelm them, to drive them back. He lifted a fallen tractor tire and hurled it at one of the soldiers, knocking him off his feet. He disarmed another, using the soldier's own weapon against him. As the fighting raged, one of the refugees, a wiry man named Silas, slipped away from the group. He moved furtively through the fields, towards a hidden comms device. Later, after the Draconis soldiers had been driven back, Gary and Aurora discovered Silas's betrayal. They found the comms device, still warm, and a coded message sent to the Draconis command. "He's been spying on us," Aurora said, her voice cold. "Giving them our positions, our plans." Gary found Silas hiding in the barn. He grabbed him, his grip like iron. "Why?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "Why would you do this?" "They promised me safety," Silas whimpered. "For my family. They said if I helped them, they would spare us." "And you believed them?" Gary spat, disgust etched on his face. Silas hung his head. "I had no choice." "The Draconis are planning to use a sonic weapon," Aurora said, her voice grim. "A device that will flush us out of the tunnels, shatter our eardrums, and leave us defenseless. You gave them the information they needed to target it." Gary's blood ran cold. A sonic weapon. He knew his strength was his weakness, a single point of failure. If they could incapacitate him, the whole defense would crumble. "The implants," Aurora said, her eyes widening. "The Draconis enhancements. They amplify pain if we can find a way to overload them." She grabbed Silas, examining his Draconis implants. "These devices, they are designed to enhance strength, speed, and aggression, but they also have a vulnerability, a feedback loop that can be triggered with the right frequency." Gary stared at Silas, an unwavering persistence settling over him. "We're going to need your help," he said, his voice dangerously soft. The days that followed were filled with a frantic effort to prepare for the Draconis assault. The farmers, their faces grim, reinforced the defenses, dug deeper trenches, and prepared traps. Aurora, using her knowledge of Draconis technology, modified the farm's generators to emit a specific frequency, designed to overload the Draconis implants. Gary, however, was struggling. The knowledge that his PTSD was now a potential weapon, that he had to embrace the rage and terror that haunted him, was tearing him apart. "You can't let it consume you," Aurora said, her voice firm. "You have to control it, use it, focus it on protecting these people." Gary knew she was right, but it was easier said than done. Every memory, every nightmare was now a potential source of power, but also a potential source of destruction. As they prepared for the final stand, Gary and Aurora faced a difficult decision. Should they stay and fight, risking the lives of the refugees, or should they try to move everyone to a safer location, losing valuable time and resources? The debate raged with no easy answers. The sonic weapon would be useless if they left, but what if their defense failed? The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the farm. The air was still and heavy, pregnant with anticipation. The Draconis were coming. Gary and Aurora stood at the entrance to the root cellars, the cool earth air rising around them. "They'll be back," Gary said, his voice grim. "We both know that." Aurora nodded, her scaled hand resting on the activation switch for the makeshift defenses. "Then we will be ready." She pointed to a crude map etched into the dirt wall. "The tunnels connect beneath the entire farm. They will expect a surface fight. We will give them something else." Based on Aurora's intel, Gary had rigged pressure plates to collapse sections of the tunnels, creating pitfalls and choke points. He'd repurposed farm equipment into brutal, low-tech weapons. The Draconis attack came with the dawn. The ground vibrated as armored transports disgorged wave after wave of soldiers. Then came the hum, a low, resonant thrumming that clawed at the edges of sanity. The sonic weapon. Inside the root cellar, the refugees cried out, clutching their heads. The sonic waves intensified, threatening to shatter their minds. Even Gary felt the pressure, a dull ache behind his eyes. He knew what he had to do. Everyone deeper into the tunnels. Gary roared, his voice barely audible over the weapon's drone. He grabbed a support beam, its wood groaning under his grip. With a grunt, he ripped it free, the earth above beginning to crack. "Gary, what are you doing?" Aurora shouted, fear etched on her face. "Buying us time." He slammed his shoulder into another beam, then another. The tunnels began to collapse, the earth muffling the sonic waves, disrupting their pattern. With each impact, a fresh wave of flashbacks crashed over him. His wife's lifeless eyes, the screams of dying soldiers, the burning fields of his past. Aurora saw the pain in his eyes, the raw, untamed rage building within him. "Gary, focus," she yelled, grabbing his arm. "Use it, channel it." "They are targeting the emitter. It is on the west field, 500 meters, guarded by 10 soldiers. She showed him the map, her finger jabbing at the location. "They will expect you to come from the tunnels, but they won't expect you to be so strong." He blinked, his vision clearing. The faces of the Draconis soldiers blurred with the faces of his past enemies. He felt a cold, burning fury, a need to protect, to destroy. "Show me," he growled. Moving with a speed that belied his size, Gary burst from the tunnel network 100 meters from the sonic emitter. 10 Draconis soldiers whirled, weapons raised. But Gary was already upon them. He moved like a man possessed, each blow landing with bone-shattering force. He remembered Aurora's intel, the vulnerability of their joints, the sensitivity of their auditory receptors. He exploited every weakness, his movements fueled by adrenaline and rage. Within seconds, the guards were down, their bodies twisted and broken. Gary ripped the sonic emitter from its moorings, its humming intensifying as he lifted it high above his head. With a final, earth-shattering roar, he slammed it into the ground, the device imploding in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. The sonic assault ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. But Gary knew it wouldn't last. He had just painted a target on his back. As if on cue, the remaining Draconis soldiers began to converge on his location, their weapons trained on him. He stood alone, a giant of a man against an army of scaled warriors. Then, a cry went up from the fields. The remaining farmers and refugees, armed with makeshift weapons and guided by Aurora, launched a guerrilla assault. They used the terrain to their advantage, ambushing the Draconis soldiers, picking them off one by one. Aurora, her face streaked with dirt and grime, fought with a ferocity that surprised even herself. She directed the defense, calling out commands in Draconis, exploiting their tactical weaknesses. And she was not alone. A small group of Draconis soldiers, their faces hidden behind their helmets, moved through the ranks, sabotaging weapons and communication lines. Defectors answering Aurora's call for justice. They sabotaged the central communication array, plunging the Draconis forces into utter disarray. Gary fought like a man possessed, his PTSD-fueled rage making him an unstoppable force. He knew they were trying to draw him out to exploit his weakness, the single point where his pain and strength intersected. But Aurora had prepared him. She had shown him how to use their fear against them. Finally, he stood face to face with the Draconis commander, a hulking brute with eyes as cold as space. "You cannot win, human," the commander snarled, his voice amplified by his helmet. "Your weakness is your compassion." Gary stared at him, his eyes burning with a mixture of rage and sorrow. He saw the commander's memories flicker before him, visions of past battles, of atrocities committed in the name of the Empire. The commander's past trauma was also showing, and Gary realized the Draconis Empire had been doing the same thing to its soldiers. "Compassion is not weakness," Gary growled. "It's strength. It's what makes us human." He lunged, his fist connecting with the commander's jaw. The commander staggered back, his helmet cracking. Gary could have killed him, could have ended it all right there, but he hesitated. He saw a flicker of doubt in the commander's eyes, a hint of humanity buried beneath layers of indoctrination. "Join us," Gary said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Defect. There is another way." The commander stared at him, his face a mask of confusion. Then slowly, he lowered his weapon. The remaining Draconis forces, demoralized by the loss of their commander and the chaos sown by the defectors, began to retreat. The attack was over. The community erupted in cheers, their voices hoarse with relief. But the celebration was tempered by the knowledge of their losses. Many had died defending their home, their sacrifices etched into the soil. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Aurora approached Gary. "I am leaving," she said, her voice soft. Gary nodded, his heart heavy. "I knew you would." "I am going to join the defectors," she explained. "We will work to undermine the Empire from within. It is the only way to truly stop them." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and admiration. I have developed feelings for you, Gary Lewis, but my duty lies elsewhere." Gary reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers brushing against her scaled skin. "I understand," he said. "You do what you have to do." He watched as she walked away, disappearing into the shadows. He knew he would likely never see her again, but he also knew that she was doing what she believed was right. He turned back to his farm, to the community he had sworn to protect. The fight was nowhere near the end. The Draconis Empire would not forget this day, but he was ready. He had faced his demons, embraced his strength, and found a purpose in the ashes of his past. He knew his PTSD and strength were now an important tool. Gary stood tall, silhouetted against the setting sun, the protector of this small patch of earth, a beacon of hope in a galaxy